And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of the Assembly Call, another special edition off-season episode of the Assembly Call. We've been going this off-season, our regular schedule, every other Monday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, bringing you a new, interesting, compelling Indiana basketball guest. Our last show was with A.J. Guyton. Before that, we had Doc Libby, Yogi Ferrell's mom, and tonight we are extremely excited to have Zach Osterman of the Indianapolis Star here with us to talk IU basketball, maybe even a little bit of IU football talk, and talk about him a little bit, learn a little bit about his background. We'll do all of that on tonight's episode of the Assembly Call. If you have any questions for us, tweet them to us at Assembly Call. I'll be checking that as we go through, and we can ask those questions. And make sure, if you're not already, that you're on the email list, assemblycall.com/subscribe. We've got some good regular updates, news roundups coming every other week that you don't want to miss. It's a good way to keep up on your Hoosiers during the offseason, so we hope that you'll join us there. Start out the show tonight, like we always do, with our banner moment. And it's actually been a pretty slow couple of weeks in terms of news for IU basketball, but there has been some stuff going on with the guys. 3 IU players were actually out at the Adidas Nations Camp or tournament or whatever it is. Yogi Ferrell, Troy Williams, Thomas Bryant, all were out there. And by all the reports that I saw, it sounds like all 3 guys played really well. I'll read a couple tweets here from Sam Vicini, who was out there, who said all 3 Indiana guys actually looked pretty good. Bryant blocking shots, getting to the line. Troy Williams moving well, threw down an oop. Yogi Ferrell looks about as good as you'd expect a senior point guard to look too, creating everywhere, finding guys, great in the pick and roll. So who knows how much stock you put in reports from a summer tournament, but it's certainly a lot better than if the reports were so-and-so has really struggled getting the ball inside but unable to finish over shot blockers, 0 for 5 so far. That's what one reporter, Nate Duncan, said about Caleb Swanigan of Purdue. So again, maybe it's just a bad night, whatever. But it's always good when your guys are having positive reports about their play. So well done, Yogi, Troy, and Thomas Bryant. Just another reason for Hoosiers fans to have some excitement heading into the season. So with that said, there's our banner moment. Let's get in and start talking with tonight's guest, Zach Osterman of the Indy Star. Zach, it is a pleasure to have you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I think this is my first time doing it this way.
It is. It's fun. It's fun doing the hangout. Andy couldn't be here. Will can't be here, but we'll have some fun talking with the 3 of us. No, when were you at IU, Zach?
Let's face it, Zach. You got the A team tonight. The other guys,
I just got a couple hard acts to follow between Libby Farrell and A.J. Guyton. That's a lot of points, assists, and years of medical school that I will never rack up.
Just don't get up and wander off in the middle of the show, and we'll be good. Like AJ. AJ was great though. He was so candid, so nice. So we appreciate that, and we love having guests like you on just to talk about the team. So let's do that. Let's talk a little bit about the team. Let's talk about this off season, because the last couple of off seasons, there's been a little bit, some turmoil. This off season, really, for the most part, has seemed positive. I mean, obviously, the news about Devin Davis and Hunter Mosquera-Perea, obviously them getting removed from the team isn't a positive, but it was almost spun as a positive in a way because of the swift decision that was made to remove those guys from the team. And then obviously James Blackman Jr.'s knee injury is not great news, but it sounds like he'll be ready. What's kind of your overall feeling of this offseason? It feels to us mostly positive. Is that kind of the sense that you're getting to?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I think the biggest thing, and this was probably always going to be the case, but this is sort of the first steady offseason that Indiana has had in a while. Each of the last 2 years before this one, they've brought in more new players than they retained. Each of their last 2 teams, they lost all but 6 scholarship players, so they've had to actually bring in more new faces than they add, whether it's freshmen or they've hit the grad transfer route a couple times now with Evan Gordon and Nick Zeisloft. And I think you've heard from these guys just, like 2 years ago, Yogi Ferrell and Will Sheehy were off at the World University Games. Vonleh was kind of in and out of town because he was doing some Nike stuff. And it wasn't quite that way last summer, and then obviously last summer culminated in Montreal. But you still sort of got the feeling that everything was kind of chopped up, and there was too much of the summer was kind of being spent letting the team get to know itself again, I guess, so to speak. And it seems like obviously you're bringing in some new faces. You're bringing in a guy that probably starts in Thomas Bryant, a guy that's almost certainly part of probably your top 8 or top 9 in Max Bielfeldt. It's hard to say on Juwan Morgan and OG Anunoby as much, but until we see more of them. But in general, even though you've brought at least a couple new faces into that rotation, there is just kind of this undercurrent acknowledgement when we do talk to these guys that this summer is nothing like last summer. It's nothing like 2 summers ago. That there's just kind of a level of institutional knowledge that has been retained and sort of built upon, that's been used as a foundation. And so it's not, and I don't like to get into comparisons too much, and I'm not trying to compare it too closely to, any of the teams, the 2 Sweet 16 teams, but you do kind of get the sense just that those teams were maybe able to accomplish some things in the summer that this team is too, just because nothing has started over. Nothing is necessarily new. You're always going to have freshmen to bring in. This is the 3rd straight year Indiana's brought in a grad transfer, so that's not new. But it's more just the idea that your leaders more or less remain the same. Most of your starters are back. A lot of your roles are already kind of clear cut, and it's just a question of how they expand and kind of grow around one another. And I think the biggest thing this offseason has just kind of been, again, that continuity that really they didn't have from 2013 until this summer.
Yeah, Zach, I really got to who am I echoing to?
I don't know.
Is that yours, Zach, that I'm echoing on?
No.
Okay. Well, so one of my things is I think that this year you're really seeing they're not hitting the reset button, like you said. It seems like it was a new team every year, like you said, the last few years. Just talk about, we've heard so many opinions about Thomas Bryant, but, what do you think he brings on and off the court? I mean, we've heard a lot about his personality, that guys just kind of are drawn to him, and he galvanizes guys almost in a way that's sort of like Oladipo. But, I mean, what have you been hearing about him and how he's interacting with his teammates and what he's going to bring to this team right off the bat? Because, as you said, he's gonna start. There's no question about that.
Well, I'll be honest, first of all, and I'm not going to act like I've seen him play, 24 times or followed his career for, 5 years, but I like Bryant a lot. I obviously anytime you got a big man that can stretch the floor a little bit, that's good. But I think he knows how to play hard and smart at the same time, and that is really not a very simple thing for a player of his age or his size. I don't think that there's, again, I try to avoid comparisons, but if you think about the last 2, McDonald's All-American big men that Indiana brought in, I don't know that Noah Vonleh as a rebounder was probably one of the best, just pure rebounding skill and instinct and intuition, was one of the best I've ever covered at any level. I think Bryant is probably more closely compared, or whatever you want to say, to Cody Zeller. I'm not saying he's going to have that immediate impact, but I think he's somebody who is maybe more developed in his all-around game, or at least is going to be able to hit the ground moving at something close to full speed in a number of different areas. There may not be one thing that he is just outstanding at in the way that Vonleh was cleaning up the boards, but I think you're going to have a guy, and all evidence so far to support it, that will fit in pretty smoothly down low. Certainly a guy that I think has come into Indiana eyes wide open. I think he understands, look, that Yogi Ferrell is back, Troy Williams is back, James Blackman is back. It's not like they're going to be dumping me the ball for 25 shots a night. I think he very much understands kind of what kind of system, not just what kind of system, but also what kind of lineup and rotation he's walking into. And, yeah, everybody, starting with and ending with Tom Crean, but a lot of people in between there. Every time Crean talks about him, he talks about his personality. He talks about just how easygoing he is. At the same time, how he's just kind of one of those people that naturally develops friendships and relationships with people. So, and that's never bad if you're returning 4 starters. And the guy that I think we can more or less pencil Bryant in at this point, unless something totally changes. The guy that is going to be your 5th starter, you like to hear that as well, that just sort of the character's a fit, just sort of the makeup of the person, not just the player, will make it a fairly easy transition to bring him in. So, I mean, right now, all feedback is good. There's certainly things he's got to work on, and obviously he's going to get tested a lot this year. Indiana will play Duke, they'll play in Maui, and the Big Ten pretty well reloaded down low with Bryant, Giddens at Ohio State, Diamond Stone to Maryland, Caleb Swanigan to Purdue, AJ Hammonds and Isaac Haas already at Purdue. It wasn't really a big man's league last year beyond, maybe Hammonds and Kaminsky and then a couple other here and there. It's going to be one this year, and so I think it's going to be important for him to flatten that learning curve quickly. But so far, like I said, all feedback positive.
He's also brought the term Pied Piper back into vogue. I don't think I've heard that term as much as we've heard it in relation to him recently.
Yeah, Zach, I also wanted to ask about the other two freshmen. How valuable do you think it is that they get to actually be freshmen this year instead of stepping in and having to contribute big time right away? They get to sort of, work their way in from time to time, stay on the bench, probably for most of the season, maybe get some playing time. But they get to sort of absorb and be sponges and then, come in and make appearances instead of having to go 20, 25 minutes a night. I mean, that can sometimes, first of all, can really wear a freshman down. And secondly, it's harder to learn on the go than it is from watching the games and sort of, absorbing stuff and then being able to act. Do you think that's going to be valuable for both of those guys?
Well, I mean, I think in nearly any sport, a year to prepare once you make the jump. I mean, even if you're talking from middle to high school, much less a jump like high school to college or obviously college to the pros. I think having a year where there's not a lot of pressure on you, you can certainly. I mean, I think as good as kind of college programs have gotten at developing players physically, I think the biggest physical jump anymore is from high school to college. Because most players are more or less done developing, in terms of like their growth and things like that. They might grow a little bit more, but it's rare you're going to get a kid, to college at 6'4", and then all of a sudden he's 6'7" or 6'8". And it's not like the pros aren't a tougher physical test, but I think that just that high school to college transition is so different now because college weight programs have become more specialized, more sort of studied and really invested in. And anytime you can give a freshman time to go through all of that, I think that's huge. People like to talk about the Big Ten being a physical league. Well, I think any league, really, especially in the Big Five conferences, is going to test a freshman physically. And then, especially for those two guys, and the one I think of maybe a little bit more is Anunoby, a player who I think could be a lot of different things in college and probably isn't any one of those things right now, but I think he handles the ball fairly well. I think he has the potential to be a pretty good jump shooter. He's obviously very athletic, and so you say, what's his ceiling? Well, if we have a year where the spotlight's not on him and we don't have to play him 25 minutes a night and we don't have to sort of really hammer down on what specifically are his strengths, just so that we can get the most out of him in the minutes that we need from him. But we can kind of let him grow a little bit more naturally, again, physically. And I think about this all the time with football. There's tons of kids that when they join a football program, coach doesn't necessarily know where they're going to play. I mean, a 6'4" defensive end could become an end, a tackle, a guard, a tackle, could lose a little weight and go out to linebacker. It's a little bit more specific for basketball, but especially when you're talking about guys that could maybe play more than one position in college, I think that year is very, very helpful. And just, the other thing is, I mean, anybody who's ever been a freshman in college, there's a lot about it that's very overwhelming. It takes you, I don't think I was really comfortable in my own skin in my freshman year of college until probably sometime in my second semester, and I think that when you consider just how much more of the spotlight is on these kids because they're playing IU basketball anyway, I think that having that time to just sort of ease in is probably very good, just sort of mentally and emotionally, not even talking about the basketball skill development side of it.
Mm-hmm. Zach, you mentioned the institutional stability, kind of the leadership that is still there. in this offseason, which is helping to kind of make this offseason seem positive and hopefully carries into the season. I guess that can be a little bit of a double-edged sword when we look at Indiana's biggest negative, their biggest deficiency last year being defense. And, I mean, a huge deficiency to the point that we all know for all of this positive talk to come to fruition and this team to fulfill its potential, this team's really got to get better on defense. But yet we're relying on a lot of the same guys to make big improvements. Obviously, we hope Thomas Bryant is a big piece down low that helps impact that positively, but a lot of other guys have to really step up, and I think a lot of us felt that there was just a lack of focus and a lack of accountability on defense last year for the whole team, and I'm curious if you're seeing any extra focus on defense this offseason in any of the rhetoric, in any of the workouts. I know on one of the Indiana MBB Snapchats, we saw the guys doing that awful drill where you have to stand in a defensive stance forever, and but who knows? I'm sure they've been doing that before. But are you seeing anything that suggests a different mindset, a different attitude toward defense that's starting in this offseason and will hopefully carry through to the season?
Well, I mean, it's obviously, one of the main talking points. It's something that Tom Crean has offered up without being asked. It's something that players have talked about, I think, without being asked, if I'm jogging my memory well. I think the big question for me defensively is how much of I would agree that in terms of just sort of individual improvement, it needs to happen. There are a lot of guys that really need to get better at just sort of the individual fundamentals of defense in college and how those individual pieces kind of fit into the collective whole, because everybody can be a good defender just on athleticism and strength in high school, and then when you get to this level, it's not just how good you are at sort of taking somebody one-on-one. It's how good you are at communicating well, at understanding coverages and how they can change and shift, and understanding when you got a split-second decision to make, why you're going this way and not that way, why you're hedging instead of cutting under a screen, why you're switching or not. And I think that's, what a lot of people, what we've heard talked about a lot. At the same time, I think the question in terms of a baseline way for defense this year is how much of last season's problems would or perhaps will be fixed by Indiana just being able to be simpler on defense, frankly. We heard a lot last year about having to really come up with quirky, almost, I don't want to call them junk defenses, but, there were times you'd see Indiana start in man and then they'd shift to a zone, or they'd start in zone and then shift to a man. And frankly, I know why they had to do that, without an obvious rim protecting presence, with a roster that was fairly young and fairly new, and with a roster that, as we kind of talked about, probably needs some individual defensive improvement. But then at the same time, there were times where it certainly felt like getting more complicated was as much of it doing harm as much as it was doing good, frankly. You'd see guys get kind of lost, and you'd wonder, is that happening in part because they're trying to sort of affect three different defenses all at once? If they can just be simpler, if they do have, Thomas Bryant, Max Bielfeldt, they can just kind of say the rim protection problem is more or less solved if everybody stays healthy. And now we can just kind of get back to some more basic defensive postures or defensive, coverages or schemes, if you want to say. And that, I think, could have an effect in just kind of making individuals a little bit better defensively, because anytime you uncomplicate something, I mean, just naturally, particularly in sports, which is so instinctive, anytime you uncomplicate something, it's going to make it easier. So I kind of wonder that's sort of the push and pull, and obviously that's something we can't answer until we start seeing this team live, whether it's in practices or scrimmages or obviously games. But that's kind of the one real question I have is how much of maybe what we pinned as individual defensive problems last year could be fixed by just letting everybody approach the problem more simply, in a more straightforward, conventional way, rather than having to be very layered and sort of very, think so outside the box like Indiana just had to do last year. I understand why they did it. I don't think they had much choice.
Yeah, if only we all had a nickel for how often we did that last year about going simpler. Let me ask you this, Zach. Am I getting an echo here too? Okay, that's better. in terms of historical precedent, because 2 years ago, turnovers were the huge issue. I mean, just awful, like almost historically bad at turnovers. From one season to the next, that got a lot better, to where last year it was a strength. And that's one positive I've taken, is that as we look towards this season, Indiana's shown recently that they can take a really bad negative and in one off season turn it into a strength. And it seems to me like there were kind of some parallels, in the offseason with Indiana. The rhetoric was talking about that. Clearly the team was focused on it early in the season. Do you draw any parallels there? Is there any confidence that could be taken by at least the program showing that it can turn a really bad negative into a positive in one offseason, or is that unrelated because it's different teams, different times?
Well, I mean, I think the difference is, I think a lot of what cut down on, obviously having a three-guard offense last year, being able to free Yogi Ferrell up more helped. I think what really cut down on turnovers last year was how much Indiana could space the floor. I think in terms of just total ability to do it, they probably were even better at it last year than they're going to be this year, because you're not going to see a lot of these. I don't think, anyway, that you'll see a lot of these unbalanced lineups with a three-point shooter at the 5 and that kind of thing. But when you space the floor better, you naturally cut down on turnovers because you open up driving lanes. You force teams to defend you differently. Suddenly they can't collapse onto players driving the ball. They can't rotate in certain ways. And so I think it was just kind of natural that adding all of that three-point shooting from Nick Zeisloff, Rob Johnson, James Blackman, obviously getting Colin Hartman back firing again, all of that freeing up more room for Yogi Ferrell, that was just sort of naturally going to alleviate turnovers. And I think that you could maybe say, again, that this goes back to that tug of war between which was the problem, or was it individual, sort of defensive issues and flaws in individual ability to play defense, or was it sort of this team concept of saying we just had to do so many wonky, strange things as a team schematically or strategically last year on defense because we were so unbalanced. And I think that if it's the second, then I would say that Indiana could make a pretty significant step forward. If it's the first, it's not like you've gone out and added 2 or 3 noted defensive, really talented defensive players. You would expect guys to get better. I mean, you would expect Emmitt Hope to be a better defender. You would expect James Blackman and Rob Johnson to be better defenders. That just comes with time and age. And you would expect that all boats will rise a little bit with Thomas Bryant coming in and Max Bielfeldt coming in. But I think if you're looking for sort of that dramatic improvement from one season to the next, and make no mistake, I think Indiana finished in the 300s 2 years ago in turnover percentage. Last year, they're top 100 in the country. I think top 60 or so in the country. Best turnover percentage they'd ever posted under Tom Crean. That I think came more from just taking such a dramatic shift in the roster from going to sort of a lot of athleticism, certainly a lot of size, to all of a sudden bringing in guys that are athletic but also can shoot the three and basically swinging in totally the opposite direction. I don't know that you can necessarily guarantee or rely on that as much with defense.
So this coming year, Zach, we've got Yogi coming back. You've got Thomas Bryant. You've got these guys who people know about, the big-name guys. Who's your breakout candidate? I mean, who's a guy that maybe isn't expected to be an all-Big Ten contender or anything like that, who you think can have a real impact on the roster? I realize the lineup's pretty set, but who do you think takes the biggest leap forward this year?
Well, I think if and I've heard some good things about his jump shot. If it can get consistent, I would throw out Troy Williams. I mean, I think you saw a big step forward in his ability to handle the ball, probably his ability to pass the ball. He's still turning it over more than he should have, but if you actually and if I'm getting these stats wrong, it's been a while since I looked at them, but I feel like, because I looked at it just every once in a while, out of curiosity, looked at sort of his sophomore season compared to Victor Oladipo's, and they had pretty similar numbers, unless I'm remembering it correctly, in turnover percentage and a couple statistics like that. So it seems like he is kind of on a similar arc up in terms of being able to handle the ball, initiate the offense, be the center of the offense without wasting too many possessions. If he can add shooting the ball, then I think you're going to see – I'm not saying you're going to see a season just like Oladipo's. I don't think Troy Williams is near the defensive player that Victor Oladipo is. He's also not really the same player positionally. Oladipo's a natural guard. Williams is much more of a natural wing. I think a lot of that just comes down to size. But I think that offensively, you will probably see a large leap forward, not just from Williams individually, but in just sort of watching how he would impact his team's offense if all of a sudden you're throwing out another jump shooting threat. And even if it's just like someone like Victor Oladipo, I mean, Oladipo didn't take a ton of threes his junior year, but he shot near 50% on three-pointers, so he was picking his looks very specifically, but he was hitting them. And I think if you get that kind of impact, that's the kind of thing that ripples out elsewhere, because Troy Williams is just such a difficult matchup already because of his athleticism. You throw in shooting ability, that's probably the one that I would throw out in terms of like who's going to take the biggest leap. I think you'd expect Rob Johnson and James Blackman to both be better, but they're both kind of positionally, you kind of know what they're going to be, or at least what they want to be. Troy Williams is somebody, I mean, you open that part of his offensive game up, and that adds 5 pages to the playbook.
Oh yeah, he's a different player if he can hit that shot.
What do you expect out of Emmitt Hope this year? I mean, I think he's another guy that people have high expectations for, but is he a year away from really stepping in and being a consistent force? Because he showed flashes last year, and obviously we were, the Pittsburgh game and some other games where he was just a terror, didn't have the consistency. Is he ready yet to be more of a consistent force, you think, this year?
Well, I think that's a question that gets answered by, frankly, how he handles Max Bielfeldt coming in. Because I think that's one of those situations. It was an obvious sort of need when they add Bielfeldt to bring him in when they did, right after Davis and Mascara-Pereira left. But at the same time, it's also kind of one of those things that you feel can be beneficial if you've got sort of this sophomore who, as you said, Holt showed some real flashes at times last year. Even if not putting up sort of game-wide numbers, he'd have these little spurts of 3 or 4 minutes where you really kind of got a glimpse into what he can do and maybe what he can be if he can get that consistent over the course of a whole game. You bring in a veteran guy, a guy who is very comfortable in the Big Ten, a guy who, in his own right, had probably the best year of his career last year at Michigan. I think if you're Tom Crean and his staff, you're hoping that those two guys kind of look at it and say, even if Thomas Bryant is starting, I want to be the first one up off the bench down low. I think both have the potential to be. Obviously, they're coming at that sort of position battle, if you want to call it that. Again, that's more of a football term, but it is August. They're coming at that from different directions in their careers. But you hope that maybe, some of the competitiveness there it forces one guy or the other to really step up and really sort of, command that spot as being, your quote-unquote, first bench forward or first forward off the bench. So I think it's in Emmitt Hope to be that kind of player. I think it's in Emmitt Hope to be an even larger force, a significantly larger force than he was last year, or at least a consistently more difficult player to handle. But I think that this is going to be, kind of one of those things where you say, how's he going to handle Bielfeldt? Does that bring more out of him, or does that, does he maybe wind up spending another year sort of soaking things up?
Yeah. We got a question from Twitter, too. Brian's asking about a lot of the energy that we're seeing from the strength and conditioning coach, Lionel Anderson, the new strength and conditioning coach. And he's kind of wondering, I've been wondering this, too. Obviously it's a new age with social media, and we're getting to see some of the workouts and peek behind the curtain. And a lot is being made of that. Is that simply because we have access to it now and we're kind of seeing it? Or is there something special that, that the new coach is bringing that is really energizing and different? Like, do you make anything of that, or is it just now we have access to a little different piece than we had before?
No, I mean, I think he's definitely different, and people have been quick to say that the way Janae Jackson did it wasn't bad. If you talk to Janae, incredibly an incredibly calculating person, somebody who understood just like down to the smallest chemical detail how to handle the human body in an athletic and a competitive setting. And I think that's how he approached his job. Was almost, I don't want to make him sound like some quirky scientist, because I mean, if you ever stand next to the guy, he's still a former football player and he looks like it, and he certainly works out like it. And I don't think that Lionel Anderson, is just showing up every day throwing everybody on a bench press. I think he knows too. I think he's just as well educated. But I just think it's a difference in personality and the way they approach their job, and that's even coming from outside the men's basketball program. Obviously, a lot of the strength and conditioning folks at IU are familiar with Anderson. He was with the football program for a couple of years. He was there, I want to say, up through 2014. I think he just spent the 1 year at the University of Houston before coming back to head up the basketball program, strength and conditioning program. So, they're comfortable with him, they know him, and yet it's still, I kind of talk to people around there, and they just, even outside the basketball program, have you seen how much energy he brings? He's just, he just has it on a whole different level. There's just a difference in personality there that I think is probably going to wind up, I think it already is maybe being reflected in players a little bit more. I don't think one is better than the other. I think they're just kind of different paths up the same mountain, and I think that if you're Tom Crean, one way or the other, what you like is that both of these coaches had very sort of dominant personalities, and these are the guys, he's very fond of saying this, they spend more time with his players than anybody else on his staff, because for long stretches of the summer, they're the only people that can work with his players, or at least can work with them on a really regular basis. And I think that you like to have somebody there that is going to be kind of this strong presence that players can rally around and get behind and trust, because you are turning them over. Essentially you're turning your roster over to that person for 3 or 4 months and saying, it's the old cliche, if championships are won in the off season, then it's down to that guy first and foremost.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about recruiting. I mean, obviously there's a lot of speculation, that we can do kind of projecting forward for the season, but recruiting is where a lot of the real action is going on right now. And obviously Indiana doesn't have any commitments yet for 2016. That's making some people panic, get a little bit worried. And I'm curious what you think. Is there one name that you think is the most important domino to fall for Indiana? Like, obviously, I think Raleigh Alkins is, obviously there's Thonmaker, who I think is the highest rated of the guys Indiana's involved with. You got Raleigh Alkins, who Indiana's been involved with for a while, and I think just finalized it down to his top 10. A lot of big-name schools in there. It feels like the momentum is dropping a little bit for that one. And then you got Deron Davis from Colorado that Indiana's been recruiting, I think, since he was in like second grade, and now has Indiana in the top 3, where it seems like there's a realistic chance, but yet he's a little lower than those guys. Can you identify one of those guys that would be the most important domino to fall? Is there one, and who do you kind of feel the best about for Indiana?
Yeah, I don't know if there's one domino, because I think Indiana's got a lot of different needs in this class. And again, just to look at it almost from like a football perspective, a lot of times guys worry about if I get offered, but they're going to offer this guy, and if he commits, then I lose my spot. Basketball doesn't always work that way. I think in part just because your class size is always such a floating target between transfers, and obviously something this team is probably going to have to worry about, which is NBA decisions in the spring. I think it's more a question of, you mentioned Alkins, you mentioned Maker. Obviously, those are probably your headline names, as you said. Throw Miles Bridges in there, although it does kind of seem like that's sort of a Kentucky, Michigan State, those two might be, nosing out ahead of everybody else right now. But I think for Indiana, maybe one of your questions is, you've got a lot of, potential options on the table here and now. Curtis Jones seems like he's very, very interested. I think Indiana's in a fantastic spot with Bruce Brown. If you ask the question of who I think is maybe Indiana in the best shape with, I would probably put Bruce Brown, the top 50 guard from Vermont Academy, in there. Lamar Stevens, Darionte Jenkins. And if you're Indiana, you still don't know exactly what size class you're looking for, but Alkins has said, I believe, unless I'm completely mistaken on this, that he wants to wait until the spring. it continues to be, it seems like it changes every week what Thon Maker's eventual plan is. There are still people that wonder if he's going to even play, a minute of college basketball. And so if you're Indiana, how do you balance, and again, it's just sort of that natural push and pull, how do you balance wanting to focus on guys that maybe that are looking at November decisions and that maybe you're in a very good spot with, versus maybe trying to leave that door cracked open if there is a really elite level player that's already said he wants to wait till the spring, or indications are that that's his plan, because you don't, at the same time, you don't want to wind up left at the altar in April when you need a body and everybody, the 3 or 4 guys that you felt like you were in a good spot with wind up committing elsewhere, and then you've suddenly got to sort of blow everything up. So I think that's kind of the big question I have as we get into what is about to start official visit season. How much is Indiana balancing kind of having the class that it wants and a class that it's really comfortable with, a class of players that it likes and that are really sort of firmly with Indiana, versus maybe trying, like I said, to leave that door cracked open for somebody in the spring. And I'm not sure that you can't do both. I mean, I'm not sure that you can't get, a couple, 3, maybe even 4 guys signed in November and still continue to be present for a couple of those elite level players that are looking at spring decisions, because I do think this is a team, they're going to graduate 3. I believe pretty firmly that Troy Williams will be ready for the NBA after this season. And then from there, I think you're going to have to ask about James Blackman. You're going to have to ask about Thomas Bryant. I'm not sure about either of those guys, but all it takes is one of the 2 going, and then all of a sudden, you've got a 5th spot open. So I think, like I said, I think you can have both of those realities. I'm just curious to see how Indiana balances the 2.
One quick follow-up on that. What's been Tom Crean's MO in the past? I don't quite remember, because obviously the 3 biggest recruits he's gotten have been Zeller, Farrell, and Vonleh. And I know Zeller and Farrell were relatively early commits, if I remember correctly. So those decisions were kind of made easy. I don't remember when Vonleh came.
On signing day. Zeller called Tom Crean, I think, about a half hour before he sent in his letter of intent.
Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah, you're right.
Farrell committed within a couple of weeks of Cody Zeller committing. They already had Hunter Perea. I mean, I think in general, when you talk about, not just guys that he's trying to, bring in to fill up scholarships, in the spring, whether it's your Emmitt Holtz, your Tim Prillers, in general, I think he's had his classes put together. I'm having trouble remembering a time where he went into a season with a scholarship unaccounted for, or at least unclaimed. I mean, obviously there was the year that he put Daniel Moore on scholarship, and I think that scholarship was being left open in no small part for Gary Harris. It didn't work out for Indiana, obviously, but it was still, kind of, you knew why Indiana was kind of going that route at that time. I can't remember a time that he's gone through a November signing window and still had spaces open, not for some reason, thinking a year or 2 down the line. So I think, I guess his MO, I would say, would be the first one, which is to have a full class. But he's also certainly, I mean, nobody kind of slow plays recruiting into the spring like Tom Crean. He's certainly someone that is very comfortable keeping things on the front burner if he needs them, things on the back burner if he needs them. And as you talk about, there are going to be maybe a couple of very intriguing names available, or at least still going through the recruiting process in the spring.
Hey, Zach, we talked about this with A.J. Guyton a little bit, and it was just about sort of how high school basketball used to be. I mean, when I was growing up and playing, high school basketball was a thing. That's where you did everything. And, playing with your high school team, developing that chemistry and getting better, and if you got better, everybody else got better kind of thing. Now it seems like, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's true. AAU basketball is far more important than what you do during your high school years. And I've seen personally, and I think AJ agreed, that it's really harming college basketball. It not hurting as far as they're still going to make a ton of money and these guys are super talented when they get there and everything like that. But the quality of play, you're just seeing guys come in who almost they're used to being these showcase players as opposed to being a part of a team. And so that transition is really hard. I mean, you see guys like Andrew Wiggins is a phenomenal basketball player and was amazing, talent-wise, but at Kansas, he really struggled a lot to fit into a team concept and things like that. Do you think that AAU is having that impact, or do you think it's the same these days?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably not just AAU. I mean, I think there's just a difference in the way that players are coming up now. If you look at virtually any sport in from the sort of the high school to college transition, you don't see nearly as many 2 or 3 sport athletes anymore. I mean, more and more players, all sports are becoming year-round. I think the one exception maybe is football. But football is still year-round. It's all contained within your high school typically. It's not like, you don't have travel football. You have travel baseball, travel basketball, travel soccer. But in general, I think that players are sort of specializing more than they ever were before, than they ever have been before. And I think that has also led to more individual skill development. And I think you see a lot more players working on individual development in lieu of maybe playing pickup or more open gym sessions with teammates or things like that. And I don't know that that's necessarily just down to AAU. I think it's down to a lot of different things. AAU is probably one of them. But I think that AAU is certainly part of sort of a culture that brings up basketball players differently. I think you talk to anybody, they tell you the level of individual talent in the game is as high as it's ever been when you think about go all the way up to the NBA level and somebody like Steph Curry or somebody like Kevin Durant. And those aren't guys that are selfish at all. They know how to pass. They know how to create for teammates, see the floor, all that kind of stuff. But I think there's just a different way that players are coming up today. I think AAU is part of it. I think there are some detrimental effects. I think there are some positive effects. And I think that just generally it's just kind of a different brand of basketball player. And if we do this Google Hangout again on hologram and 2035, we'll probably be talking about something totally different because these things, they just come in cycles. I mean, that's just the way that it happens. The game starts to change. Suddenly Michael Jordan changes the way we all look at how basketball can be played at the NBA level. That slowly but surely starts to filter down. You see, I've argued forever that one of the things that I think works in Kobe Bryant's favor and LeBron James' favor that Michael Jordan never had to deal with is that Michael Jordan was the only one who played like him when he was in the pros. And all of a sudden, Kobe and LeBron and all these guys that wanted to be those tweener guard wing players have to deal with a league full of players just like them. Because everybody everybody emulated LeBron, or not LeBron James, but Michael Jordan. Everybody saw the way Jordan played, suddenly wanted to go do it that way. At the same time, you don't see the Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, I mean, Shaquille O'Neal, you don't see the dominant center that way but everything just happens in cycles is my point. I'm rambling here. I apologize.
No, I think that's a great point. One of my favorite stories like that is Noah Vonleh. When they asked him what he wanted to be, he said Kevin Durant. And, you think about that, it's like, was this big, strong, muscular kid who could probably dominate in the paint, at least in college, and he's thinking about shooting threes because he sees Kevin Durant and sees how popular that style is. But also I think that you make a great point about guys playing individual, working on individual gym sessions and things like that, and so much the guys are so into weightlifting and things like that and individual workouts and stuff now compared to where it used to be. I mean, whenever we used to want to work out, we go play pickup, and it's like you said. I think that's a great point. Actually, it's not, I agree. I think AAU is just a part of the new culture, that is sort of sprung up around basketball. And like you said, though, I mean, the talent level is unbelievable right now. It really is everywhere. And one great thing about AAU is guys who would never get noticed, maybe, or from a non-basketball playing state or something, get a chance to play with these other guys and get noticed and maybe get a scholarship out of it. So there are positives and negatives as far as I'm concerned. But
hey, Zach, let me ask you a quick question about Noah Vonleh. One of our longtime listeners, Chuck, actually emailed me earlier today and wanted me to ask you just about the sense you get of kind of where his career is headed. Obviously, drafted by the Hornets, didn't do much his first year. They ship him out to Portland and kind of replace him with Kaminsky. So it doesn't seem like the best the best omen, I guess, for what they saw in him for a year. But then it looked like this summer he played pretty well. Do you get any sense that? And we know he's a young guy, obviously. Do you think that he's still got a bright NBA future, or do you think he's gonna kind of struggle to find his place?
Well, I mean, I think I think the potential's always been there, and I think even when he went in the lottery last year, a lot of people that I talked to said, and I don't want to act like I had conversations with 36 different people, but kind of the consistent thing was there was nobody should believe he was anything close to the finished article when he got into the league. And my impression, at least what I picked up on when the Trailblazers picked him up from the Hornets, was that they were picking him up in part sort of as insurance in the whole LaMarcus Aldridge saga. And I'm not saying that he is the next LaMarcus Aldridge or anything like that, or that he's not. But it is interesting to me that you look at a player like Vonleh, who, if he can get near his ceiling, is going to be able to shoot the three, handle the ball. I mean, pick and pop situations, pick and roll situations. He's going to be able to rebound very well, even against players that are bigger than him, because it's important to remember he's not the biggest dude in the world. I mean, I think he was still, about like 6'9" when they measured him out at the combine, but he's got that incredible wingspan and great rebounding instincts. So if you can get him near his ceiling, then I think he's one of those. I think he is, in a way, almost the prototypical modern NBA player, in that he can both play maybe 3 different positions on offense and guard maybe 3 different positions on defense and impact the game in a number of different ways and be very athletic and just, long-armed and change shots at the rim and all those sorts of things that you look for in a big man in today's NBA. But I think anybody who looked at him had to know, coming out of college, he was nowhere close to that ceiling this time last year. I know he had a couple injury problems during the season. That'll always set you back a little bit. It seems like Charlotte in general just isn't totally happy with the way their roster was made up. They made a number of moves, and I think we're rumored to be trying to make a couple more that didn't come to fruition. So I'm curious to see what kind of opportunity he gets, because, as you said, I think he had a pretty good summer league. I'm curious to see what kind of opportunity he gets in Portland, how they use him, and just generally, I think he was always going to have to be. When you look at like Zeller or Oladipo, I think you looked at them and said, here are players that, whatever they are in year 3, they can keep growing, but we're going to have a very good idea. I think Vonleh, you'd have to get more to year 4 or year 5 before you're really comfortable saying this is his career trajectory, this is where he's going. Because, I mean, in year 5, he's still only going to be 23 years old. And again, he's, in my mind, and maybe he doesn't get to it, I don't know, but he is so far from what his competitive ceiling would be right now.
Yeah.
So we have a little bit of time left. Love to spend it just kind of learning a little bit more about your background, let the audience get to know you a little bit more, because obviously, you spend so much time giving us information about the Hoosiers, and I think people like to know the people who are covering the team. You're from Georgia originally, right? You from Atlanta?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay,
Born and raised in Atlanta. Had never lived outside the state until I came to IU for college.
Yeah, so what was that like? What brought you to IU, and how'd you kind of get to where you are now? I'm curious about that journey. What brought you here?
To be honest, I really didn't want to go to Georgia. Georgia's got a great journalism school. I knew I wanted to do this, but a lot of my friends went to Georgia. People I'm still friends with and all that. I felt like college might have been my only chance to do something different. To just try something different. I kind of knew I wanted a big state school. I knew at least I wanted a big school, and state schools are generally, even out of state, just cheaper than private schools. And I had a friend named Daniel Kuniansky, who was a direct admit to Kelly, who said to me one day, she said, you should look at Indiana. It's actually not that far from home. It's between 8 and 9 hours drive. It's a pretty straight shot through Louisville and Nashville down to Atlanta. And they've got a good journalism program, I think, and it's basically just like UGA, except it's not UGA. And I think Cooney and I both felt, sort of the same way about Georgia, that we just kind of wanted to try something different, and wound up here. Joined a fraternity, met a girl, rode Little 5, got a job, all those things, and next thing you know, I'm sitting in a 3-bedroom house in the office of a 3-bedroom house behind a bookcase, with wedding pictures, old hockey pucks. My signed Tom Glavine baseball's up there somewhere. So, yeah, it just kind of all happened organically. But I visited Indiana. I was pretty sure it was where I wanted to go, and I remember I visited the weekend after Little Five in 2005, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. And by happenstance, my tour guide, because I did one of those official campus tours, was actually a kid who I went to high school with. He was a senior when I was a freshman, and I got to know him fairly well. And just totally random, he wound up also leading my tour. So pretty much just fell in love with the campus and all that, and everything else fell out from there.
Well, as a fellow out-of-stater that wound up in Indiana, I can tell you that I was the same way. I just didn't know. I wanted to do something different, and it's the same type of thing. We both actually wound up at the IDS, the lovely Indiana Daily Student. I think you were a freshman when I was in my final year.
Yeah.
I do remember Zach from college. I was introduced to him a few times. What were your beats at the Indiana Daily Student over your 4 years? I think that would be an interesting one.
Yeah, because I didn't get into sports until my junior year.
Okay.
I didn't have like a specific. We joked because I wound up covering like all the Black History Month events my freshman year, which was really cool and really eye-opening for a white kid from the suburbs, of Atlanta, which I really enjoyed. And it also culminated in me interviewing James Earl Jones, which the only time I ever used the phone in my dorm room, he called that phone, and it's legitimately the only time in my entire career that I've ever actually been like intimidated by the person I was interviewing. Never. I mean, I've interviewed athletes naked. I've interviewed commissioners. I've interviewed people after the Final Four. It was the only time I ever just thought like, holy crap, like this is insane. This is
Darth Vader, man.
But I'm trying to think. Women's basketball, I think, was my first official beat, and then I took over baseball right after that, and then I was men's basketball columnist my senior year. I was sort of tacitly. It was proposed that I might be one of the men's basketball reporters, but I also rode Little Five, and so it would have been a very hard balance with all the travel. So, but I also did a tour as assistant campus editor, 2 semesters as sports editor, and I was editor-in-chief of the paper in the summer of 2007.
Oh, well, I didn't know you were a columnist also. I thought you were the basketball columnist also. I thought you were just the beat reporter. Awesome.
No, I was a basketball columnist.
Well, we're in that same fraternity, buddy.
I followed you and Ryan Carrazza, and then who was Jonathan Hines would have been the columnist the year before, that was the year of all the Sampson stuff.
And Mac Linesk was right before me, who's your buddy at the Star. So yeah, that would have been right before my time, because I didn't even get into the IDS until the very, very end of my freshman year. A friend of mine named Peter Stevenson, he and I lived on the same floor together, and I kind of did all the IDS orientation stuff, and then I stepped away because I pledged a fraternity, and then I joined that fraternity's Little Five team, and just things kind of started to snowball the way they do when you're a freshman, and I think Peter basically just dragged me in. It was the last night of dry runs, which for those, I guess, for a couple days before the next semester staff gets to take over the paper and basically practice putting it out. I know most people aren't going to know what that means. And I got handed this story about the 25th anniversary of John Lennon's death, and then Rick Newkirk, who was the incoming editor-in-chief and also a massive Beatles fan, saw it, decided to pitch it front page, and all of a sudden I had like a front page story on my first night at the paper, which was terrifying. But the next semester I came in just to general campus news. In fact, I did it for 2 semesters, and then started editing, and one thing led to another.
So you didn't grow up in a place where basketball is as big as it is in Indiana, and now you've been connected to the Indiana men's basketball program for many years now. What's that been like? Covering a team that obviously there's such just a crazy fan base. What's that been like for you? Not necessarily growing up in an environment where there was that kind of insane fervor for basketball.
Well, I did grow up in that environment. It wasn't for basketball. It was for football.
Yeah.
I mean, I played high school football in Georgia. I had friends who, went on to play college football in the Southeast. I lived through, I don't know how many, basically until I graduated and left for college, every single SEC championship weekend in Atlanta, which is like Carnival in December. I mean, it's never just the two teams that show up. Because, I mean, Atlanta is to the SEC very much what Chicago is to the Big Ten in terms of that's sort of probably the central hub of where alumni that go to big cities land. And so it doesn't matter who makes the SEC title game, they're going to turn up, they're going to turn out. And even if it's, Tennessee, Alabama, you're still going to have Florida fans and Georgia fans and LSU fans and Auburn fans that are just, turning the town inside out that whole weekend. So, I mean, I guess the fan part of it was never really that surprising because, again, it's on a different scale. You can't compare like 6 home football games a year in a 100,000-person stadium to 20 home basketball games a year in an 18,000-seat arena. But the idea of fan fervor and just sort of that deathly loyalty, if you will, to a program and to a college athletics program was nothing new when I got to Indiana, and it was something that it's been something that I think you could draw a lot of at least very basic parallels. Even I mean, it's now been 10 years almost. I think I came to college on August 23rd, 2005.
Yeah.
I can still just sort of draw parallels today of things that pop up that I say, well, that reminds me of, going to Sanford Stadium in October of 2004 or whatever.
And you've obviously gone through some pretty tumultuous times at IU, but you missed Bob Knight's tenure at Indiana. Would you have wanted to be around covering Indiana when Bob Knight was there, or are you glad that you missed that and didn't have to deal with, obviously, a guy who was known to just be pretty much a pain in the neck to deal with for the media?
No, I would have really enjoyed it. I mean, he was a fascinating person. He was a fascinating character, a fascinating figure, whatever you want to say. And I think the reality is, that there are lots of times when people think you get into this job because you're just a big sports fan, which you kind of have to be to do it, obviously. People think you get into this job, Purdue fans think I get into this job because I just love IU and I hate Purdue, and, why would I do anything else? The truth is, I think most of us get into this job because we enjoy telling stories, and we enjoy, like, really just kind of finding things that we can relate to, basically finding ways to relate people in their everyday lives to other people in their everyday lives. And sometimes those people are very famous and sometimes they're not. Obviously, in my respect, I'm going to deal with people that are more well-known. Just generally when you cover sports more often than not, you do. If it's college or pro sports, you're going to have people who follow it and know the general players involved, the coaches, the players, etc. But I think what you look for most are just really good stories, and really good characters or really big characters always produce the best stories. And, people still talk about Frank DeFord's Bob Knight profile with reverence. How many other college basketball how many other college basketball coaches in the history of the sport, in sort of modern American sports, have a story written about them or a book written with them as a central character that resonates 20, 30, 40 years after it was first published. I think Knight was fascinating. I'm sure there would have been times when I would have sat there, swearing at him under my breath or complaining to my wife about something I'd had to deal with. But, the characters are what make it interesting. They're what really lend color to what's going on around you. I think more and more people aren't looking for – they're not asking you to recite box scores. They're not asking you to just sort of spit statistics at them. They're asking you to give them something that they can't get off the Big Ten Network broadcast. And Bob Knight, for all of his weaknesses and all of his flaws, there were plenty of things that you would never have gotten about Bob Knight off the Big Ten Network broadcast.
That is for sure. All right, a couple final quick questions for you here before we wrap up. What would be your dream sporting event to cover that you haven't had a chance to cover yet?
That's tough, because the Final Four was pretty cool. This is very personal. When I covered the Sweet 16 in Atlanta in 2012, and I was sitting, they dropped the curtain in the Georgia Dome, and they cut it in half that way. They didn't do sort of the elongated court with the whole thing open. And on the side where the media were seated, I could actually pick out the seats, or at least the rough area where my dad and I had season tickets in 2001 to the Falcons. That was Michael Vick's first full season as a starter. That was the year they tied the the Steelers in Pittsburgh, one of the strangest football games I've ever watched. And just generally, like, when, again, I knew I wanted to do this, and in part I wanted to do it because my dad was a sports writer and then a journalist when I was growing up. And the experience of covering an event like that in my hometown, I mean, it was kind of one of those moments where I did sort of stop and look around and just kind of try to breathe it all in. If I could cover like an SEC title game, I think I'd really enjoy that. Not for the players involved or because I like football more than basketball, but just because like that was kind of the thing that I grew up thinking, like, this is where I want to be someday. An SEC title game in the Georgia Dome would probably be that, or there's any number of soccer matches that I would absolutely love to cover at some point. Probably none involving Liverpool because I wouldn't be able to handle the objectivity part of it. But
well, that's a great segue, because when I tweeted out a request for questions before we started, the very first question I got was from Jay Horry, who asked, will Liverpool ever be a big club again?
Well, Jay has a very underdeveloped sense of humor. I'm actually pretty optimistic, perhaps too optimistic for my own good, but we'll see. About Liverpool this season, I think that a lot of mistakes have been learned from, both in the transfer market, which is, people who don't know, it's how you gain and acquire players or lose them if you don't want them anymore or they want to leave. And also just in kind of the way the club has been structured and the first team is run. I think we filled a lot of holes. I think this is probably I don't know that there's one sort of dominant player, and that's certainly what I've been used to with Liverpool for the last decade or so that I've followed them, whether it's Steven Gerrard or Fernando Torres or Luis Suarez. I don't know that there's one player on this roster that's quite that good, but I think that there is probably as much strength and depth, at least right now, before the injuries pile up and guys go out of form, as of any Liverpool team I've ever seen, and I've been following them since I was 17. So this will be year 12. So I'm excited for the season. I think they're still a big club. I think there's any number of ways I could illustrate that to Jay Horry if he wanted me to. I don't think we have time for that, though, and I think you'd lose a lot of viewers very quickly, including maybe Jay Horry. But I think it could be a very good year.
All right, well, Zach, thank you so much. This has been a real treat. Hopefully we can have you on here again, because this was great. And I feel like we only scratched the surface. I love, kind of starting to hear those stories that you were telling about growing up with your dad. And that, it's funny you say that, because that to me is why I still love doing this with IU basketball games, because it all goes back to watching the games with my dad when I was growing up. And it's funny how the things we become passionate about as we get older have their roots back there. And I think that's the case for a lot of us. So it was cool hearing that. Thanks for taking the time tonight. This was a real treat.
No, thank you for having me. I had so much fun.
And for anybody who's not already following Zach on Twitter, you probably are, but it's at Zach Osterman. Follow him on Twitter, get all the latest updates on the Hoosiers. And we appreciate you watching live. We appreciate you listening on the podcast. Make sure you go to assemblycall.com/subscribe and get on the web's fastest growing IU Hoops email newsletter if you're not already on it. We would appreciate it. And we will be back in 2 more weeks with another special edition off-season episode of the Assembly Call. We may do Ryan's trivia episode then. We'll see. If not, we'll have another incredible guest here for you. So we'll talk to you soon, everybody.